Councilman Lowell H. Lebermann, Jr. This video interview is being made in February 1987. Councilman Lowell Lebermann was elected to 3 terms on the Austin City Council beginning in 1971 and served 6 years. Because of his pioneer interest in environmental issues, for instance, he sponsored the formation of the city's first environmental office. He was called the Green Panther during his term of office. His community concerns were far-reaching and covered every facet of the city's operations. He is well remembered for his sense of humor, as well as his close attention to financial detail and the city's budget. Councilman Lebermann, good to be with you, sir.
Nice to be with you, sir.
A man who is so involved in community activities, and particularly in your business interests, how did you find time, first, and second, what led you to want to run for city council?
Well, Glenn, the fact is that that I'm a 5th generation Austin Central Texan, and my folks have been here for that long and have been involved in community affairs for a long period of time. As a matter of fact, anecdotally, I have in this desk drawer a directory from the city of Austin dated 1877-78 that has the Carrington Hardware and Dry Goods Store at 920 Congress Avenue, where the Republic Bank is today. So I have a real sense of community when we talk about Austin and Travis County, and it was because I remember so well going to Laguna Gloria Art Museum when it was on the river out on Lake Austin on 35th Street with my grandmother when she was president of it, and being with my grandmother and her friends and talking about Austin and watching Austin grow, that made me feel that it was important to give back to a community, and much the same thing that motivates anybody, I think, probably to run for office unless they have much broader political ambitions, which I never did.
And in 1971, the year you were first elected, there were many issues facing this community, and I'm sure some of them were more important to you than others. What are some of those?
Well, let's go back a ways. After the end of the Second World War, when Austin really began to grow, the University of Texas, of course, with the GI Bill, and incidentally, Mr. Cootes, I was 30 when I was elected to the council, so these issues that I'm describing tend to predate me, except in memory and as a historic feature of an effort to answer your question. But after the Second World War, when the University of Texas began to grow under the impetus of the GI Bill and some of the teacher legislation that passed through the state legislature and so forth, Austin began to grow, of course, with it. The state government was expanding, and to some extent the business base, although narrowly, in Austin. The developers, professional developers, were coming back into the city and trying to meet the dramatic new housing needs after the Second World War, and Calcasieu Lumber Company, always a big influence in this town, both as a business and as a supplier of men to run for the city council and for political office. It was an interesting kind of thing to watch that business and how it impacted this city. In any event, as those issues began to emerge, issues of growth and development, which led us through the 50s and the 60s as the entire state was beginning to grow, it became very apparent by the early 70s that the issues of growth and quality of life and things that have been talked about since, to the extent that they are pablum-esque, now were very real issues at that time, the early 70s, when we could actually make a difference. We could mold trends, at least we thought we could. And so some of those kinds of issues, clean water, our environmental concerns, how we were going to approach growth, if we were going to continue to urge it in an expansive way by paying for sewer and water and streets and those kinds of things through refund contracts, which this city used to have and doesn't anymore, or whether we were going to try to limit growth through density controls and and those kinds of things. Matters of traffic, how we were going to relate to business expansion through annexation policies and things like that were major issues confronting cities all across the Southwest and through the Sun Belt. None so much, however, as Austin, because Austin was such a small community with such a narrow base infrastructurally that we really had some big problems that were potential and in fact came to be later on.
In this year of 1987, we are still, or the community at large is still concerned, or talks a lot about anyway, the environmental aspects of this community. Back in 1971, when you were first elected, the city government per se did very little in that area. You established the very first environmental office. Tell me why did you have that particular interest?
Well, you'll remember in the 60s, middle to late 60s and early 70s, environmental concerns were emerging as a body of national public policy issues. Texas tends, and then is now, but particularly then, to lag behind national trends, particularly where social policy is concerned. Well, specifically where social policy is concerned. I mean, we're a conservative state, tend to move slowly and cautiously, and there tends to be some public policy inertia, I think, in the state, and I think that's fair. It's not a criticism so much as an observation. California, Florida took the lead, the far west, western United States, Washington, Oregon, and the rest, were taking the lead in environmental concerns. Things like clean water, bottle bills, erosion abatement kinds of issues, fish and wildlife concerns, those things. Austin being an extremely fragile kind of environment, and it truly is, with topsoil only inches deep over white limestone rock and so forth, problems that plagued early pioneers who thought that this was a fertile river valley, and it was, but it was miles wide and inches deep, and of course the erosion simply took the topsoil away. Those kinds of things concerned us. After all, as you well know, Austin is built on a system of watersheds, of small creeks and valleys, and that tend to flood very quickly, particularly when development occurs, and roofs and hard surfaces and streets and intersections and things of that sort are put in place without much concern to the runoff issue. So I was really concerned about all those sorts of things, not only for the health and safety, but also for the beauty and the comfort of the community. Austin, being a water-oriented town with hills, unique in Texas, really, needed to be protected so that the things that we all loved about it and enjoyed about it, and all the students that ever graduated from the University of Texas wanted to live here because of, needed to be protected, and I set about to do that. Long answer, but broad concerns.
I think you have outlined pretty much what you expected for that office to do. Then you had an opportunity to watch it put your thoughts into action. Were you satisfied with what it did once organized?
Well, yes, and let me say, Glenn, that there's a big difference between being satisfied by the achievement of ideal circumstances to the extent possible, where you already have development and a municipality in place, as opposed to planning it and going forward from absolutely raw land. There's a difference in the satisfaction that you take in knowing that the thing is going to be properly protected, and the anxiety that you experience by putting the ordinances in place and making those votes when you're impacting the economics of the people with whom you live. So there's a real sort of dichotomy of emotion. I think the office has done a good job, and I think that it has continued to. It's been confronted by tremendous controversy, but I think 100 years from now and beyond, that the ordinances that seem confiscatory now, that seem to be excessive and so forth, will accomplish for the city what the citizens of that time will be grateful for. Let me call your attention to Lamar Boulevard, which in 1987, and when it was built, I suppose in the late 30s, early 40s, was built in combination with the highway department, and a very wise highway engineer insisted that the city and the state buy a great deal of extra land because of the beauty of the terrain through which Lamar Boulevard moves in a serpentine path north to south. And that extra land is Pease Park today. I'm sure at the time they thought, the old-timers around thought that that was a ridiculous expenditure of public dollars. And today we regard it as a very gentle, softening kind of neighborhood park that runs right the way along Shoal Creek and adds tremendous beauty to a traffic corridor. So you see, I think that those issues that seem to be particularly abrasive in terms of public policy development frequently appear very wise in later times with changed demographics and the pressure of growth. I think that will be proven to be so with regard to the Office of Environmental Resource Management.
Well, and following through on what you just said, historical precedent already, the Mopac Boulevard that began, I guess, in study in 1940s or maybe even earlier to get the right-of-way, but it was only until your terms of office and that council that actually began putting down pavement.
That's exactly right. I think there were something like, I misremember, but 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 votes perhaps on Mopac. It went on and on as a major controversy, and of course has eased the traffic situation dramatically. Environmentalists would still tell you that it's a disruptive thing to the environment, to the Edwards Aquifer recharge zone out to the south. But after all, a municipality is or a city is nothing except a whole system of sort of environmental and public policy compromises. I mean, you can't achieve perfection. People live here, people drive here, people work and have all their human activities here, and that is always a compromise as it comes against the environment.
You said it, I think, that sure, it had lots of votes and there was lots of controversy, but in 1987 we are blessed with having the only major artery getting in from the north to our downtown area.
That's exactly right. I use it all the time. And voted for it every time I had an opportunity.
Yes.
The voting started before I think I had attained my majority.
There was another environmental concern, which also was very controversial at the time, and I'm talking about the Walnut Creek Treatment Plant.
Yes, sir.
And the council in which you served met many times, voted many times.
Endured public hysteria.
In the late 70s, early 80s, it turned out that was the only sewer plant the city had that was operating as it should and was taking care of our major problems. In only 10 years, it proved its worth.
Well, that's true. That's true. But in addition to, well, let me say that the issue there was one of economics. Pitted people of modest means against people of perceived much larger means. It pitted racial groups against one another. That was the hazard of that situation, and the fragility of it. It made I think that the controversy itself and the emotion stirred by it far exceeded the actual substance of the issue. I mean, the issue was where we were going to put a wastewater treatment plant, and you tend always, of course, to put them in the flat because of the influence of gravity vis-a-vis the movement of wastewater, and regrettably, that happened to be in a part of town which, at that time at least, was predominantly black. And to some extent Mexican-American. That's no longer the case, and I'm sure as people watch this film over the years, it will diminish even more. But at the time, that was the case, and so there was that controversy between members of the black community, particularly some of the more energetic leadership, younger leadership, saying that it was just the white side of town trying to put wastewater treatment plant in the black side of town, and of course that's not the way the council saw it at all. And to that extent went to huge expenditures and great lengths, as you will remember as a public information officer, going around the country looking for state-of-the-art treatment facilities that could be put anywhere and could be made attractive to the eye and in no way noxious. And I think we achieved that largely.
That plant, even in 1987, is still being visited by people from other nations to see how you can have a plant that is at once beautiful, no odors, no sounds, and does the job it's supposed to do. And I think that was a major credit, of which in the early 70s was not perceived that way.
No, it was not.
Another, of course, a continuing problem, we've touched a little bit on the transportation issues, but a problem you faced in 1971 was the transit system. The city had floundered somewhat in solving a problem. Private enterprise was not solving that problem, and your council did solve that problem.
What was it said of the transit system, which was a private enterprise transit system, which I suppose reflected the narrow economic potential of such a system as an actual business? And that is to say, the equipment was bad, the service was terrible, and it was referred to by a waggish journalist of the time as a banana republic transportation system. And that's the way it looked. I mean, it could have been in some beleaguered Central American country, except it would have been a third-class operation there. And so we did.
That's
yes,
true.
We did go to some lengths to put in place a very modern transit system. It seems, as a matter of fact, just this morning. What's the date today, Glenn?
February of 1987, the 4th.
February the 4th, 1987. I attended a meeting, which was a meeting of the current mayor's business roundtable, where we discussed the current transit system in town, which in its scope and sweep and budget amounts and so forth makes our original little municipal system that we so proudly put in place in the early 70s pale into insignificance. But by the same token, it was a beginning, and that's kind of where you have to start when you're making changes. But Austin was growing in the 60s by 1.5% to 2.5% a year on a very narrow population base. By the early and middle 70s, we were growing at 3.5% to 5% on a, of course, increasingly broader base. And so we needed to move fast to make changes. In short, we were a town that was moving from adolescence to young adulthood, with all the growing pains implied by that analogy. And that included expansion of services of every single kind, municipal and social and civic. The arts were growing. As we speak in 1987, it's contemplated that within the next 18 months, Laguna Gloria Art Museum will move downtown to a new location that was donated by business people here in the city. And bond elections were passed on the order of magnitude of $14 million to build that new building. The symphony has expanded. We have 2 ballet companies. Those kinds of things were just beginning in the 70s, actually, to emerge as important statewide class kinds of activities. The hospitals were growing. Transportation systems were suddenly necessary, and the airport had to be enormously expanded. You'll remember, and that remains, of course, a big issue today, 15 years later. Because the community is still growing, even though, of course, we're in a major economic downturn at this time. But that's what we were confronted with: whole brand new notions that had to be examined and put in place because of the demographic significance of this expanding population base in Austin and Travis County.
You mentioned it a minute ago about whole new areas to look into, and I'm reminded that it was during your years on the council when the very first time municipal government began looking at cultural, welfare, if you will, issues as a responsibility of government. Prior to 71, very little money was put into those areas. Gradually, the municipal budget has grown in those areas. Did you have a part in that?
Yes, I did, and felt like that that it's the responsibility of a city to take care not only of its affluent citizens and provide them their needs, or to help provide them their needs culturally and with libraries and all the rest, but in addition to that, to take care of citizens who have very specific health needs and economic needs. There's a balance there. A city's responsibility can only go as far as its means will permit, but a city, to me, to be a really great community and a great city must be a community, a place with a heart and a place with a soul and a place caring about the arts and about health care and about people concerns. And this city does. But that was just beginning in those days. We didn't have neighborhood clinics, if you can imagine. The only thing we really had was a city-county hospital, which ultimately was turned over, of course, to the city for its exclusive management and funding, Brackenridge Hospital, which does an excellent job. But there have been lots of years when that was one of the principal economic drains on this city. But it's a responsibility of a community to provide a community hospital that takes care of the indigent as well as the affluent, and that provides really sophisticated health care. It was back in those days, as you point out, that budgetarily we were beginning to provide seed money. I learned when I was on the council, Glenn, that seed money meant startup money and an opportunity to come back for growth money, expansion money, sustentation money. It's endless. And so you have to know as a municipal figure that if you provide startup money, you better know where the next dollars are coming from, because that group will be coming back to you. Minority arts groups sprang up all over the city, experimental arts groups of all kinds. And the list goes on and on about the new areas of human, civic, and municipal concerns that the council of the early 70s began for the first time.
Now, there's been some question about some of the things you've said, and as a businessman, do you think it's good business for government to be involved in cultural affairs, in the financing of cultural affairs?
Absolutely. Absolutely. A city is not simply a collection of people living together with a police and fire department. It's much more than that. And the arts organizations that reside there and are supported by it, both from the private sector side and through public funding, are an absolute expression of what a community thinks about itself and the way it views its past, its present, and its future, in my judgment. And I think most this sounds self-serving, most enlightened business people would agree with that, and not only are willing to pay through their tax obligations for libraries and for arts organizations, but they also give generously through their businesses and privately.
Well, I would say we talked about the wastewater treatment plant, and I believe the councils that you served on nipped that one in the bud at that time and certainly put the community ahead. But another surprise that occurred was a great energy crisis of the early 1970s. It probably caught everybody by surprise. And of course, it put the council into a controversy, and there were two of them. You mentioned earlier also that the council pioneered in going around the country and seeing state of the art. In the energy field, the council did as well. And you went to see a nuclear power plant. You went to see a coal plant.
Yes, we did. And
you ended up funding those and getting those started, one of which has been supplying energy for many years quite economically, the coal plant, Fayette Power Plant. The STNP in 1987 is still a point of controversy. Tell us about those years and as an environmentalist, how you looked at that nuclear power plant.
Probably the gas supply crisis of 1970, late 72, I suppose, is when it began, did it not?
72, yes.
In 72, and continued for 2 years when our gas contracts were essentially voided by our gas supplier, Coastal States and Lavaca Gas Gathering Company, which ultimately, the latter was ultimately dissolved, taken away from the parent company, Coastal States, and became an entirely new freestanding company, which the city and the customers had ownership in, but that's another subject. Our gas cost moved from 22 cents a million BTU to as high as $3 in as short a time as 18 months, perhaps shorter than that. I recall that we had in 82 and early 72 and early 73, we were having meetings on a weekly basis to have the most recent gas costs reported to us, and it moved to 75 cents and $1.25 and $1.75 and $2 and $2.50 just in a matter of weeks and months, and it was absolutely destroying our system. There was no way to move. There was no way to restructure the cost of service in order to pay for these fuels, and so we had to move as quickly as we could to introduce other than oil and gas-fired plants into our system, so that we would be able to spread out the nature of fuels and get a stable cost. When we got with LCRA, of course, the Lower Colorado River Authority, and developed the Fayette plants in LaGrange, Texas, and that, as you point out, has been very successful. Of course, at that time, coal prices were going up, not as fast as gas, but going up to match it, and we developed some Western coal contracts, which have been a point of controversy, and in fact have been overturned since that time. There was even a time when we bought railroad cars. The city of Austin bought railroad cars to help bring the coal in here. I mean, it was a genuine economic crisis for this city because, of course, the thing we haven't said that may not be realized is that the city of Austin owned its own electric utility, and that is unusual for a city of our size. And so that's the reason that the city council was directly involved in the development of the power plants and fuel use and so forth. Then came the idea, of course, of nuclear, and with the cities of Houston Lighting and Power, rather, and the city of San Antonio and Central Lighting and Power and Corpus Christi. LCRA chose not to participate. We developed the South Texas Nuclear Project. Extremely controversial from the very beginning, thought to be extremely expensive. Opponents said that it couldn't be brought in on time and on budget, and were they ever right? They couldn't. I voted for it because I felt that we had to have a diversity of fuel uses or fuel sources if we were ever to have a stable economic situation for our electric utility, and in order to supply electric power to the businesses and to the households of our service area at a reasonable price. We did go to Boston, as it was, I think, and went out to see a power plant in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and walked around became instant experts, of course, in nuclear power. I walked around, and since I'm blind and was at the time as well, I did take my seeing eye dog with me, as I remember, as well as my council aide. As I remember, the then Mayor Butler of Austin said I would probably have the brightest illuminated dog anywhere after she visited that power plant. But we were convinced by experts it wasn't so important that we go to the plant for technical reasons. It was that we go as a demonstration of the genuine effort that we were going to bring experts together to advise and counsel us on the economics of nuclear power, as well as the safety of it. As an environmentalist, I was not so concerned about the generation of electric of electricity through nuclear power, but I was very much and remain concerned about the disposal of the nuclear waste. Still an unanswered question. Of course, now the city of Austin in '82, wasn't it, voted to withdraw or to sell our 16% of participation in the South Texas nuclear project, and the city council is wrestling with a suit as we speak with Houston Lighting and Power in an effort to get out of that investment as close to whole as we can. I predict that they won't be able to, and that some settlement will occur. But it'll be interesting to see whether this prognostication comes true. I expect that we'll walk away from an awful lot of dollars, but those who are against that investment feel that to put more money in it at this time would not be wise. And the controversy that rages today, 1987, is not at all unlike the controversy that raged at the time that we made our investment in '73.
It's the very same one, I would say.
It really is. Yeah.
We might point out that this year, the first unit of that project is supposed to start producing electricity.
That's exactly right.
And I think we're 2 years away from the second unit.
That's right.
I think, and many of the folks that were around in those times in 1987, they like to crow a lot, but I would presume that many of the decisions you made, you have an opportunity to second guess yourself years later, and that would be one of them. The Walnut Creek plant would be one of them, and Mopac would be one of them, all of them with different levels of success. But wouldn't you say that of most of the things that were done from the councils of which you served, probably the STNP is the only one that anybody could successfully criticize today?
Yes, I think so. And knowing what I know today about the economics of the plant and the anxiety that the dreadful Chernobyl experience in the Soviet Union, the explosion of their nuclear plant recently, has focused on the operation of those plants, I would say that had I to do it over again, I would try to find other means to solve that same problem. I mean, the problem wouldn't have gone away, and it was a legitimate piece of the solution puzzle to go forward with STNP at the time. I wouldn't do that again today, however. As far as the other two items, of course I would. You know, it's interesting. When you mentioned that we were going to have this taping and what it was to be like, more philosophical than specific about little issues, I was really glad, because the issues that councils deal with week in and week out, that frequently fill the entire chamber with near hysterical citizens, are difficult to remember today.
They really are.
Oh, they really are. And what seemed of critical importance 10 years ago, and indeed 2 months ago, has now faded virtually from memory.
Yes, for instance, you probably just vaguely remember the so-called drag vendor issue.
Oh, I remember it merely because we dealt with it for so many years.
And yet today, I would say there's probably not a handful in that entire area, and no one cares.
That's right. Glen speaks for the record of university students and people who lived near the university who were not necessarily students, who wanted to vend their wares, originally arts and crafts made by themselves, along the streets and sidewalks in and around the University of Texas, and the university wouldn't permit them on their campus, so they wanted to be on Guadalupe Street, or that section of Guadalupe called the Drag. And then eventually it became such a lively business that they were actually vendors of goods, manufactured goods that they purchased elsewhere, frequently in Mexico and so forth, and around the city and the country, and they would bring things that they had not made. Well, the numbers really got to be important, and they got to be a traffic problem and so forth, and they asked us, and we finally did, close off a portion of a short block between San Antonio and Guadalupe. I believe that was
26th Street.
26th Street, that's right. And we did that on certain days, and it was a constant hassle. the council, with merchants on Guadalupe expressing the legitimate concern that they were paying taxes and had this high overhead and so forth, and here were these people not who were supposed to collect sales taxes, but I suspect that they didn't do so with enormous accuracy. And it was a raging controversy, which, as you say, has simply vanished as an issue.
I think one of the critical issues facing Austin in 1987 is its debt. And as a businessman, but even more than that, as someone thoroughly familiar with the financial issues around the city budget, and you were very close to it for 6 years, that has to be of some concern to you, that enormous debt that has built up through the years for legitimate concerns, but nonetheless, it's hanging there. How do you feel about that?
Well, I feel, I permit myself to be told how to feel about it by Standard & Poor's and the bond rating people. And our bond ratings, of course, have steadily slipped, and it's a real problem. That the debt in this city is uniquely divided between the revenue bond side, the revenue debt, which of course is tied to revenue producing functions, our water and wastewater and electric utility. And that debt seems quite huge until you remember that the electric utility is a proprietary business, and its debt capability is very specifically tied to its income producing capability. And so I worry less about that, except for a utility transfer fund, which needs to be brought out, and that is where income from the electric utility, or some portion thereof, is transferred into the general fund. And that is one of the specific differences between our electric utility and a private utility, because those dollars are so greatly needed. And years ago, it was thought that because we were a state capital, and something like, help me, Glenn, 45 or 48 or 9% of the land mass within the corporate city limits was not...
It was about 50%.
About 50% was not subject to ad valorem taxes. They were churches, the University of Texas, federal and state governments, eleemosynary institutions owned by the state hospital and so forth, none of which were subject to property tax, which meant that as we grew, we had to have additional revenue. So the revenue that was produced by the electric utility and transferred to the general fund of the city of Austin became extremely important, together with grants and aid and federal government participation, as with other cities and so forth. So, in answer to your question, though, our general obligation debt is extremely high in this city, and I do worry about it. And obviously, the bond rating houses are concerned about it as well. And I think that we're going to have to be extremely careful, particularly as we move through a very uncertain future with our real estate business, our financial institutions in trouble, our real estate business of all kinds, single-family and multifamily developments in big trouble, our commercial development in big trouble, a diminished enthusiasm at this moment for plant relocations from around the country, significantly impaired by the recession that Texas finds itself in because of the oil and gas crunch and the difficulty in agriculture, and all of those things, business activity on the sales tax side of our revenues and so forth, affect our ability to run this community and to pay our obligations through our bonding capacities. And so I think it's going to be a real problem in the future, particularly if this downturn in our economy continues for over long.
I would say that in 1987, compared to your first year in office, in fact, all 6 of the years you were in office, then it was a period of optimism. As compared to today, people are very cautious. The business scene was very optimistic in the early 70s, were they not?
Extremely optimistic. Of course, in 1974, there was a major economic downturn in the real estate markets in Texas, and it was thought to be a terrible crisis. An article in the paper this morning, the Austin American-Statesman, quoted someone as saying that by comparison to today's real estate situation, 74 simply look like a Sunday school picnic, and that's certainly true. But on balance, as a moving average experience from the early 70s until quite recently, this was one of the most optimistic, one of the most exciting places to live and work and do business. In fact, I'll tell you that the University of Texas at Austin, for the 6 years from 1980 to 85, the 5 years from 80 to 85, expanded its chairs and lectureships and permanently funded academic scholarship funds and so forth by over $100 million. People were so successful in Texas in the oil and gas business and the real estate business and in small business development and so forth that they couldn't wait to give money to the arts and to the University of Texas for permanent funds and scholarships and the like, and that's all gone now. I mean, it's extremely difficult to raise money even to sustain activities in the city at this moment. I don't expect, of course, that to continue, but it sure was a lively place to have lived and worked and been on the council in the early 70s.
There's two other issues I wanted to bring up. One thing a council does from time to time is make a change in its personnel, and that is the one person that most responsible of the council, the city manager, and your council did that. I'll let you talk about those circumstances, but a city manager left and you had the opportunity to appoint another one. And you'd like to discuss the reasons for one manager leaving. In this case, let me say Lynn Andrews left and the council appointed Dan Davidson to succeed him.
Precisely. Lynn Andrews had been here for 6 years when we took office, 5 perhaps, when we took office, and was a very controversial manager. As we speak, and at the time that I served on the council, we had and have a council manager form of government. It'll be interesting to it would be interesting to know if those watching this film, first it'd be interesting to know if anybody's ever going to watch it, and the second thing,
I'm sure they will.
And the second is what form the city government will have taken at the time that they are. But council manager form of government with the city charter, described in our city charter, provides that the city council will and does appoint the city manager, and the city manager hires everyone else in city government. And so that is the way, that's the ultimate expression. That and the budget are the ultimate expressions of the will of a council and the goals and philosophy and direction of a council, or at least a majority of that council. Lynn Andrews was a controversial fellow because he didn't have a very cooperative spirit with the council and tended to make policy, which under the terms of our city charter is the sole purview and responsibility of the city council. The city council sits rather as a board of directors, whereas with the mayor being chairman of the board and the city manager is sort of like the president of the company, whose job it is to carry out those policies but not to make it. And so when it became obvious that Mr. Andrews was not going to get along with our council, which was a pretty strong-willed lot, I must say, he left, and we engaged his deputy, Mr. Dan Davidson, who had probably the most successful tenure of any city manager in the history of this city for the next, 10 years?
At least, yes. He served about 8.5, I believe, more or less. I know that you had a very good working relationship with Dan Davidson, and I think the other members of your first 2 councils did.
Of the first 2 councils, not of the third.
That was the next issue I wanted to talk to you about. You served 6 years, 3 terms, and the first 2 terms, I think you genuinely enjoyed yourself and was most effective. You were part of the majority, of course. Your third term, you were, was it a one minority that you were?
It was a minority.
Or did you have anybody to vote with you?
It was
on anything?
a minority of 2, Mrs. Himmelblau.
Oh, that's true.
And
yes,
I tended to vote together. And that's not to say that I took issue or umbrage with every single thing that the majority of my third council did or thought or said. That's not true. I agreed with them on numerous issues, but frankly they moved philosophically substantially to the left of where I was with regard to municipal governmental philosophy, and as a result, I had a real growth experience. I found myself in the minority of a governmental situation for the first time in my life, and it was a grim experience.
I recall that, and I remembered your frustrations, which many times simply ended with you just laughing about it and turning from it.
Well, that's true. As a matter of fact, during one budget cycle, I expressed my anger in a not very mature way, I must say, by simply storming out of more than one budget hearing, because I felt that that particular council was not a crisp, professional group of folks who had a sense of what the city should be and didn't approach things in a very businesslike way. Now, on the other hand, they did many good things, and perhaps my positions were not suitable for the time. I don't know, but they were my positions, and I held them rather deeply.
Councilman, I think something that's important to anybody that lives in Austin are our Highland Lakes. What are some of your observations on the development along those lakes?
Well, the Highland Lakes are, incidentally, Glenn, let me say thank you for continuing to call me councilman. It means more today than it did. Remember in '71 when I went on the city council, we were paid $10 a meeting, and that is if we attended, and we didn't have council assistants or aides at the time, and that's all changed. But I appreciate your glamorizing my past. The Highland Lakes are absolutely key and critical to the essential Austin, in my judgment. Senator Wirtz, and if I may have a personal aside, the room in which we're sitting as a part of the house, my home, here at this moment, was built by Senator Alvin Wirtz, and was later owned and occupied, of course, for 30 years by Frank C. Irwin, Jr. And I suspect that we'll get to an issue that involves former chairman of the Board of Regents, Mr. Irwin. But Mr. Wirtz, Senator Wirtz, had the idea of the Highland Lakes, a system of dams that would produce electric power for REA, for rural electric co-ops, and for flood control and management, as well as for irrigation issues down the Colorado River. As luck would have it, those key issues impel the development of the LCRA, and recreation and environment was the beneficiary, because the Highland Lakes, now particularly Lake Austin and Lake Travis and Town Lake, are absolutely key stars in the crown of Austin and Travis County. It's been extremely important that we that we protect those lake shores, and that we work carefully with LCRA. As we speak, LCRA and the city of Austin are hard at negotiations on water use from the lakes. As our population has expanded, we've needed more water than the original contracts call for. And those negotiations are not going well for the city of Austin at this moment. It'll be interesting to see how those play out. In addition to that, LCRA is even talking about sewage treatment for the future, which would take over part of the municipal function of the communities around and about, and would give them tremendous leverage as far as development around the Highland Lakes are concerned. And frankly, I feel like LCRA is somewhat less environmentally sensitive than the city of Austin is vis-a-vis those lakes. Those lakes have impelled such issues as motorboat use and safety issues, the use and development of City Park, which incidentally, when it was purchased by the city in the 20s, I figured it up one day, cost 32 cents an acre. And no, that was, I'm sorry, I believe that was 32 cents. Yes, that's right, 32 cents an acre. And and it's one of the most important parks that we have, together with the regional park Zilker. at Barton Springs. But the Highland Lakes are an extremely important feature, and one day I would hope that we would have a water and wastewater or a wastewater collection line all around at least Lake Austin and down either side. A sensitive matter that that caused great controversy were the protection of the Highland Lakes with the Lake Austin Ordinance, frankly, that I brought forward in 1973-4. It was which was an attempt to protect the fauna and flora, the slopes, to set aside the concern about erosion and control densities in the Highland Lakes. It was said at the time, when I called in a fancy architect and land planner from Philadelphia with the concurrence of my colleagues on the council to help with that planning, that we were trying to create sort of a park for the very wealthy, because of course we were controlling densities, and that was particularly amusing considering that it was not only that ordinance was passed by one of the most liberal councils that we've ever had, and by the next most liberal council, this current one, in the recent history of the city of Austin. It has been substantially augmented. Nonetheless, I think it's an extremely important ordinance, and I hope it is maintained throughout the ages for the city of Austin.
Comment, if you would, on the relationship of LCRA and the city of Austin. You mentioned that has deteriorated, and I think we would all agree that's not to anyone's interest.
It certainly is not to anyone's interest, because of all of the river authorities in Texas, LCRA, the Lower Colorado River Authority, is probably the most important. It controls the largest number of entrapped acre feet of water of any. Its rice farming concerns downstream, of course, are of major agricultural importance to the state, and that water must be husbanded for release at critical times in the rice farming periods. In addition to that, this entire hill country area could simply not have been developed without LCRA and rural electric co-ops. And the two big major co-ops that are serviced by LCRA and are now in conflict with them, wishing to develop their own generation systems and plants, were developed by the hydroelectric capacity of LCRA long before we had coal-fired plants that were built by the city of Austin and LCRA. The 504 average altitude line around the lakes is the point at which the city of Austin takes over land use planning. Above 504, I believe that's the correct, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Above 504, we, the city of Austin, we're always able through extended zoning practices, strip zoning and and the like, to control land planning all around those lakes, and that has been extremely important to the protection of them. And that's the reason that far, far out of the city limits, the city of Austin was able to have an impact on the land use planning and the development of those lakes. I remember when an old ranch called the East Ranch that was owned in part by former governor, the late Alan Shivers, greatly admired, of course, Texan and citizen of Austin, together with with a development company called Southern Living, was to develop that 2,400 acre ranch. And it was the most magnificent development plan you've ever seen. Very sensitive to the land uses and to grades and to the trees and natural grasses and so forth. Density was just right, and it was to be a handsome, cutting edge kind of development. The issue was what would happen between that development and the city of Austin vis-a-vis traffic. The infrastructure, of course, of roads and the rest, was simply not adequate to have 4,000 or 5,000 households out there, a whole new city that would necessarily interface with the city of Austin with regard to jobs and the rest, and tremendous transportation issues back and forth. And once a development happens outside a city with a lot of raw land intervening between the two communities, that land fills in right away, and that was going to create big problems for the lake. And I could go on and on about the details of it. That would be tedious, but also required a municipal utility district, which I was against at the time. The vote was 3-3, and I was called on for the final decision-making vote. I greatly admired Alan Shivers, and my public relations person for all my campaigns, and my very good friend, Mr. Neil Spelt, had as his #1 economic client that development firm, and I voted no. It was the toughest vote that I had to make to that date. And it just demonstrates the difficulty and the complications associated with the decision-making process and the making of public policy at the municipal level. It's the most difficult elected governmental job you can have, because it is so immediate to the people that elect you. And your friends are there in the audience watching your vote, urging your vote, and it's like making a decision or courting in a fishbowl. And it's not like the Congress or any other office, and yet it's extremely important to the lives and health and well-being of the people over whom you have at least temporary governmental authority.
Locate that East Ranch site. Wasn't that pretty close to City Park?
It's above City Park toward Mansfield Dam,
Yes.
Lake Travis, and it is now River Place. It is called River Place, and a developer in the city just now, who has been greatly negatively impacted by recent economic events here, has built a country club there and has an excellent development in progress, but it isn't going forward, and he'll in fact probably lose it.
Well, it's unfortunate. Jumping to another subject, a very dramatic thing occurred in the council chamber at one time, and you were there. A very good friend of yours, Dr. J.J. Seabrook, was
yes.
making a plea for an issue. Tell us about that.
That was the single most dramatic moment during my time on the council, and I submit to you that one of the most dramatic moments that could have occurred in any city, and that is Martin Luther King had of course been assassinated a number of years before, and before the Congress was the issue of his birthday becoming a national holiday, and the sentiment swept around the country that a memorial to Dr. King should be in each city and township and state in the country, an issue with which certainly no one on our council disagreed at all. In this case, they wanted to change the name of 19th Street, remembering that all of the streets running east and west from the river are numbered 1 through ultimately some infinite number, probably to South Dallas. Wanted to change the name of 19th Street to Martin Luther King Boulevard, and that was being actively resisted by the businesses along 19th Street, not because it was they wished to not honor Dr. King, but because it was going to be very complicated for them mechanically to change their business addresses and all the rest. And then there were those in the city who simply didn't want to honor him, disagreed with his goals and purposes and practices and so forth. And then there were others who wanted, like some of us on the council, and I was among them, who rather than break the sequence of streets, numbered streets, wanted to pick a park, a lovely park, or a great thoroughfare around the city and memorialize Dr. King's life and times and great works in that way. But at any rate, it was a legitimate topic for conversation and controversy at the time. And Dr. J.J. Seabrook, who had been president of Houston-Tillotson College, a great black educator and a great American, a super friend of mine and most of the members of the council, years since retired at that moment, was in the council chambers with the young people, largely black, from Houston-Tillotson, who were before the council advocating the name change. And the questions had gone back and forth, and the debate raged rather actively in the council chambers, and order was a little difficult to maintain. And Dr. Seabrook finally, in frustration, deep frustration, rose to address the council and begged us not to turn aside the wishes and will of these young black people who felt it so important that that particular street that joined east and west through the central part of the city, that joined the city together, be named for Martin Luther King, and that the issue exceeded any possible disadvantage to anyone and would be very divisive if he wouldn't. And he was a very eloquent man, and he raised his voice in plea for their cause. And in mid-sentence, he became very quiet and very still, and Dan Davidson, the city manager sitting beside me, suddenly leapt to his feet and said, "Someone help the professor." And numbers of folks raced to his side, and he'd had a cardiac arrest and died at the podium, and I'm confident was dead before he collapsed to the floor. And of course, after he was taken away and so forth, there was simply no doubt about the outcome of that issue, because Dr. Seabrook had died speaking to the issue, and of course it was immediately decided that 19th Street would be named hereinafter, and is now Martin Luther King Boulevard.
A very, very dramatic moment.
It was indeed.
Another controversy of the times was the expansion of 9th and 10th Street from Lamar Street to the central area of downtown. It's a beautiful park today, but at the time, critics of that expansion called it a destruction of parks. You'd like to comment on that?
Well, it was. Interestingly enough, and I hope as people are listening to this with interest about the archaic past, that the issue of east-west corridors has been solved, but it's gone on all of my adult life. We've tried First and Second Street one-way combinations. We've tried any number of things, always resisted by the extremely powerful neighborhood organizations in the city. 9th and 10th was no different. We absolutely needed, from Lamar Boulevard, because this was before MOPAC was built, it was in the building stages, I suppose, 9th and 10th Street were critical to move traffic into the downtown area. There was a tiny, tiny bridge on 9th Street and 10th Street. Do I have those reversed?
It was on 10th Street,
on
and
10th, 9th Street
go through.
Stopped at Shoal Creek. And it was felt that if we built another bridge across Shoal Creek, which was at that point a little more than a ditch, not beautiful as it was up above through Peace Park and the like, that it would destroy trees and destroy parkland and so forth. Finally, the issue was resolved after huge controversy. We built good, nice-looking wide bridges and reversed those streets one way, and made and created the loveliest possible park below those bridges and along them and above them, I believe, as well, with a wonderful hike and bike trail all the way to Town Lake, which by that time was well underway as a beautification project led by, of course, none other than the former First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson, as we built hike and bike trails around Town Lake. And so it integrated the Town Lake beautification plan with Shoal Creek and that Shoal Creek Park there. So that was a happy ending to high controversy, demonstrating, frankly, this, I think, Glenn, and that is that people frequently become so immersed in a single issue orientation about public policy. That is to say, these people thought that they were doing an environmental work, when in fact it was contra-environmental. And the fact that we were able to move traffic more effectively into the central business district was extremely helpful to the flow of people in and out of the central business district and to the broader reaches of the community. Created a lovely park and a hike and bike trail, eliminated an eyesore, solved a flooding problem to the extent that that was altogether possible, and was a demonstration that we need to think beyond the most peripheral aspects of an issue, particularly as it relates to the more complicated items associated with the multiple problems that you face in a growing city.
Well, I think there's no doubt about it. It's a jewel we have today.
It is indeed.
I know something that you, in all of your public life, and I'm sure to this day, always believed in, and that is better working relationships between the governmental entities or a business community. For instance, historically, there's been ups and downs between the city and the county, the city and the state legislature, the city and the Chamber of Commerce, and our great university. You played a key part in a negotiating activity back in your term, which is a very interesting time, solved many, many problems. Tell us about that, the team itself and the players, and what was accomplished.
That was an interesting time, and I don't know whether I contributed much to the effort or not, but I sure did a lot of growing up during the negotiations. Let me tell you about the teams and the issues. There were 35 unresolved issues between largely land matters and utility easements and relatively minor things between the University of Texas at Austin and the city of Austin. And they'd gone on for many, many years, and most of which had lain dormant. The then chairman of the Board of Regents was Frank C. Irwin, Jr., an extremely powerful, enormously bright, and very controversial man who dedicated much of the last years of his life to the growth and development of the University of Texas. He led that team. He wanted very much to unify the campus, the central campus, with the then East Campus, where Memorial Stadium is, and all the way to I-35. That involved changing Red River to a two-way system and closing San Jacinto Boulevard, which ran through the campus, which was a major way that people in near North Austin got to downtown and back. So that was very controversial, but they had the right to do it. The university had always had the right to close it at any time they chose. As a trade-off, they wanted to widen and help improve Red River Street and make it the principal midtown thoroughfare. Very, very controversial, as you can imagine. In addition to that, we wanted to establish ownership and control of the small park, the name of which I've forgotten, Rosewood Park, perhaps, Robin Hood Park, in the middle of Upper Town Lake below Tom Miller Dam. There was some controversy about ownership and control. And mainly, they wanted to take back Lyons Golf Course, which, as we speak today in 1987, is once again at issue because the lease between the City of Austin and the University of Texas runs out this year. And for 35 or 40 years, that has been a golf course and a green belt and a park system in central West Austin along Enfield Road, 400-odd acres. That belongs to the University of Texas, which is, of course, not producing income for them. So those issues had to be resolved, and they were big, high-dollar, high-emotional issues. And Mayor Butler assembled a team. Mayor Roy Butler, Lowell Lebermann, and Councilman Bob Binder, who was in his first term on the council at that time, having replaced, I believe, former Mayor Pro Tem Dan Love. And the negotiating team from the University of Texas, with the chairman of the Board of Regents, Frank C. Irwin, Jr., former ambassador to Australia under Lyndon Johnson, Edward Clark, who was a senior member of the extremely influential law firm of Clark Thomas, and former governor and member of the Board of Regents, of course, Governor Allen Shivers. All three men, incredibly awesome,
yes, I can well imagine.
Legendary figures. And when we first walked in to the room with them to negotiate, I observed to Mayor Butler that I hope he had been doing fingertip push-ups because I felt substantially overmatched. But we were all friends, particularly Mayor Butler and I were friends of all three of those worthy gentlemen, and we all had to live here in Austin and all cared, never mind our governmental or regental hats, we all lived here, cared deeply about the city, and resolved all issues, I think, very satisfactorily. Extended the lease for 15 years on the golf course. They participated, the university participated economically in the widening, and repositioning of Red River Street. We closed San Jacinto, etc. So it all worked out.
Well, would that the current negotiations are meeting with the same level of expertise on both sides of the table?
Well, I hope so, although I'm not sure such lives today. But
Councilman, are there any other issues you would like to bring up for this oral history, which on behalf of those who will be seeing it in the future, I extend you my thanks in their behalf?
I've enjoyed it very much, Glenn. I appreciate the opportunity. I only wish that 50 years hence I could watch this without too much embarrassment to see how the changes have continued occurring as they have in the brief time of my adult participation in governmental civic affairs in the city of Austin. I remember when the town was 85 or 90,000. It's nearly 500,000 people a day, with the SMSA being over 1 million. And today, where San Antonio and Austin, as recent as the time that I was on the council, were tended to be at loggerheads periodically and certainly in competition, now have joined together in the Austin-San Antonio corridor, which seeks to bring the communities all along I-35 from Round Rock and even Georgetown to San Antonio together in a planning effort and an economic development effort. I hope that has continued as people watch this show, this taping, and that we have succeeded in an economic reality which the potential of which is certainly in place today. I don't really think I have anything else to talk about except to say that the last 20 years in this city have seen changes that exceeded anything from the founding of the city during the Republic of Texas, when it was called Waterloo, here on the banks of the Colorado. The last 20 years have seen more changes at the University of Texas and in state government and municipal governmental affairs and growth and the economy of the city than anything that's gone before. It's not a sustainable growth, and I hope it becomes more rhythmic, more sequential, more manageable over time. I know that the city has so very much because of the bits and pieces that are Austin: the environment, the university, the state government, the expanded economic base, the people who care so deeply about the community have continued to provide the energy that will make it a viable, lively economic place, and that as a quality of life, it remains a real standard of communities in this region of the southwestern United States, and for that matter for the country. I've enjoyed participating over the last several years and hope to have a good many years of participation left, and thank you for coming into my home and letting me talk about these items. Thank you very much, Councilman. Place 4, Lowell H. Lebermann, Jr., 6 years service, 1971 to 1977.